First thing we are doing with this project is putting an outline on a piece of cardboard to make a template and figuring out how big our shelf bottoms need to be so that they will fit all of the shoes we are trying to store there. You'll see me trying to reduce the overall length of the shelf here by a little bit, and the reason for that is the closet space we're working in is super narrow, and we want to get these shelves as short as possible so they have a less steep incline so our shoes aren't straight up vertical on these shelves. So I'm trying to get a better estimate by dry fitting with the cardboard before making my test piece out of wood and doing the dry fit check with the wood, just so I save more wood doing this project. Now you'll see I just cut all of the shelf bottoms here out of wood. That's because I did all the dry fitting in the full length video. I'll link that in the description below. And now here I'm ripping down a 1x4 board into some like 1/2 inch strips, and those are going to be the front trim pieces on the front of the shelves to block the exposed end grain of the plywood. First I'm cutting them to thickness, and then I'm going to be notching the back so that the plywood has a channel to sit into. This will give it a better seal over the edge of it, and will also give a little rigidity to the shelves themselves so they're less likely to warp over time. Plywood's a little warp resistant anyhow, but this just adds a little extra stability just in case. And more importantly, because this is a very steep shelf, these shoes are going to be at a very sharp incline. This is going to act as a stopping block at the bottom. That'll give the shoes something to catch on. That way it won't just immediately fall off when you go to store them. Next, I trimmed down some 1x4s to make the H-frame that's going to be on the back side of the shelf, and then I cut down one of the extra shelves that I had cut to make a top catch-all shelf that's going to hold my wallet and some watches and things like that. I trimmed the length of some of those front trim pieces to cover this catch-all shelf as well. I cut a few dummy blocks to be shelf holders later on, and then we go into sanding everything just to take away all of the sharp corners because we are going to be touching a lot of these surfaces fairly often. As with any project that has a lot of small pieces like this, take your time, just make sure you really get all of those surfaces, especially the ones you'll be contacting. And in my case where I have some discoloration on the plywood, the stain's going to cover that up. Those are going to be the bottom sides of the shelves. Don't worry about that too much. Don't worry about trying to sand it all out. And then naturally my memory card died, so let's jump to the next day. Now off screen I realized that I have to have a standoff board on my H-brace that's going to be like the frame of the shelf, because I've got that bar in the center of my closet that's going to keep the rest of the shelf off of the wall anyhow. So these 3 boards that I just quickly sanded, those are going to be my spacer boards. I'm going to do top, middle, and bottom. Then the next big task for day 2 is getting all of the holes pre-drilled. So we already get the pocket holes for most of that frame, and then we're getting some pre-drilled holes on those back spacer boards that are going to go straight into our wall behind the shelf. I clean up all of the drilled holes by hand just using some relatively coarse sandpaper. This was either like an 80 grit to a 120 grit. Then we're ready to get everything prepped for staining. I start washing everything down with a paint thinner to get all of the loose dust and debris off of it. I realize there's a few pocket holes that I missed, so I go back and drill those. Then we're back to cleaning everything off. You want as much of the dust removed ahead of staining as possible. That way you have a clear surface that you're starting with, so the stain is more effective and gives you a more consistent color throughout. This is some nasty stuff. You can see it is literally shredding my chemical resistant gloves here. So needless to say, being a well ventilated area, I would still use a respirator. I'm using one here. This is not good for you. So try your best to keep it off of your hands, keep it out of your lungs, keep it out of your body. Now with all the materials cleaned off and everything spread out so that I know I have enough space for when we're staining it, I'm ready to shift gears and get the stain mixed so that we can move on to the next phase. Once again, well ventilated area, respirator, and I have a glove only on my staining hand. I got a little bit on my other hand, but you want to limit your exposure still. The paint thinner chewed through all my other gloves, so I was just working with what I had. Just don't be lazy like me and go out and get more if you need more. Now I have done a separate tutorial on how to stain wood. I'll link that in the description below. And then after I stain all of the things in this project, I got so much on this table anyway, and I already needed to finish this workbench that I just built. So I'll put a link to that in the description below for the build and the staining of the workbench as well, in case you want to see that. Otherwise, there's nothing too groundbreaking or project specific for this. This is pretty much just a general technique I'm using here. But if you haven't already figured it out by the stain slowly spreading on this unfinished surface, protect whatever you're working on if you care about it. Otherwise, you will stain the crap out of it. Wrapping up the stain here, we're going to jump ahead to day 3. I let these all sit overnight to dry out and kind of cure up a little bit. And you'll notice the workbench itself is also stained in this next scene, which is what I was referring to in the workbench build linked in the description below. I'm setting up the workbench in my garage this time because I'm no longer dealing with the chemicals, and all the excess fumes from the stain and stuff have already flashed off of this. It's been sitting long enough, therefore it's a little bit safer to work inside. On top of that, this is still protected from the weather. I've got my speakers in here, so it's a little more enjoyable, and I can leave it set up in here, so if I don't finish it in one day, which I didn't, I don't have to constantly move it out of the way, take it back inside, and move things around, so it's going to save me a little setup time when I come back to this after another day or two. Something I want to point out is that when I'm putting screws into these pocket holes, I'm clamping in the direction that the pocket hole is is angled in. If you don't, these do have a tendency on occasion to kind of walk out. Just something to be aware of if you are using a pocket hole jig. It's not a huge deal. It's obviously not a difficult problem to resolve. It is literally the only downside of pocket holes that I can think of, other than maybe the level of effort if you want to fill the holes afterwards. Now, after installing the second leg of that H-brace that's going to go on the back to support the shelves, we move on to installing the front cap pieces onto all of the individual shelf bottoms. If you remember from earlier, I cut a channel into the back of all of these front cap pieces that the shelf fits into. I'm filling that with wood glue, but obviously a lot of it's squeezing out. Just make sure that you clean up as much of the excess squeeze out as you can. Otherwise, that can discolor the stain if you leave it there for too long. I am touching up all of the nail holes with just a little bit of stain just because I can see all of these nail holes regularly with where they're located. Now we're shooting into a 1/4 inch piece of plywood, so that's very thin if you're going through the front of this trim piece. As a result of that, I cut a bunch of extra trim pieces and a bunch of extra shelf bottoms in case I did miss a few, which I definitely did during this build process. For this reason, I knew that was going to be a real risk. I made sure I practiced with the shelves before moving to that top catch-all shelf because I didn't cut a spare for that, and I wanted to make sure my aiming was on point prior to doing this one because I had no replacements for it. After installing the backer board that's going to be on that top catch-all shelf, we then install the spacer boards at the middle and the bottom to keep the spacing off the wall consistent throughout the entire height. Then we're ready to dry fit this entire assembly in the closet. While dry fitting, what I'm really looking for is how do the holes that I'm going to be using to install this on the wall line up with the shelves, and will I be able to access these after the shelves are in place? And what I really figured out is that no, I won't be able to access them after the shelves are in place. The shelves are going to block those screw holes. Therefore, I have to install the shelves after this is already bolted to the wall. However, I am going to have to install the bottoms that these shelves are going to sit on onto this H-frame prior to putting the H-frame into the closet, especially because of how precisely I'm going to need those located to keep the spacing even on all of these shelves. It's really important to get this all lined up perfectly. It's just going to be much harder to do that with this already installed on the wall when I'm doing this vertically, when I can just do it flat on my bench right now. So that's what you see me doing here is after dry fitting all of the shelves to make sure that I'm happy with the spacing, I install the very top and the very bottom shelf blocks and then go and measure out what space is actually remaining and place the remaining shelves in there. This way I know all of the intermediate shelves will be spaced on the actual location rather than just whatever I calculated ahead of time in case I screwed up on literally anything leading up to this point. Now it's worth noting that I did put one less shelf on here than I initially planned to on the finished assembly. On the full length explanation video, I said it's because I completely just did my math wrong, but I think it's because when I actually dry fit everything, I decided I didn't have enough space between shelves. I didn't like how it looked, and I took one shelf out as a result of that. With all of these backer blocks installed, I almost installed the first shelf thinking I would be able to reach around it and still be able to get everything installed on the wall. But then what I realized very quickly is that the shelf would immediately block me from installing the shelf below it. So therefore I had to install this on the wall first, and then I had to install basically the bottom shelf and then work my way up. Before getting to that stage, I did put some support blocks for that top catch-all shelf just so that had something to tack into as well. With the frame ready to go, I went back to the closet and got everything lined up at the height that I already figured out I wanted to hang this at. I did have all of the screws already started in those backboards, so it was as simple as holding everything in place and then just drilling everything straight in with the screw already there. Now this block I'm putting on the top right is to make sure I don't have a massive gap on the back side of the trim when I have that catch-all shelf. I had to actually trim this board down to get it to fit, and after a quick dry fit, I put a final dummy block in the back corner after that block behind the trim piece was in. Otherwise, it would not have been able to slide it in there. Then, just as I planned, starting from the bottom and working up, I installed all of the shelves. I'm just tacking it into the dummy blocks that I had on that left side H-frame. Obviously applying wood glue first just to give it a stronger bond long term, then just rinsing and repeating until I finish off the shelves and I get to the final shelf. But I stop before putting that catch-all shelf on the top only because I know it's going to prevent my access and there's really no going back at that point. So what I noticed, and I explained in the full length explanation video linked in the description below, the front right corner as viewed here is a little bit flimsy because it was unsecured on that side, so I decided to put another block on the bottom side on the right of each shelf that went directly into the back of the trim piece. That made it way more rigid, so it'll probably hold up a lot better long term. Finally, I moved on to that top catch-all shelf, and then I installed the final dummy block in that front corner to block off the edge of that trim piece on the front, only because that was overhanging a little bit. I didn't want to see the exposed end grain of the plywood, and I didn't want to risk catching that and potentially breaking that piece over time. But there you have it. That is the completed project. If you want a little more detail on the build, build. I've got the full build linked in the description below. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.